screams in the night. Indian legends. Miles of footprints. Sightings. What are these elusive hominids that stalk the wilderness? Join us for eyewitness accounts, questions and answers, Bigfoot encounters of the past, and ongoing encounters in the present. Your host, two-time witness, field researcher for 43 years, William Jevning. Welcome to the mystery. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Creek Devil. We have a special treat today. We're joined by Norma and Bob for an update. Tom, I'm going to have you start off with the interview.
Okay, great. Norma, how's it going?
It's going great. How are you guys?
Good, very good. So you and I chatted a little bit last night or yesterday, and you've been going out pretty regularly, and you've got some new activity. And actually, you've got some vocalizations, as I recall, that is kind of new for you guys. Fill us in on what's been going on.
Well, we've been going out quite a lot since the pandemic, unfortunately. I mean, it's, good in that way, not so good in others. So we've been going out and to our regular location, which, is kind of fun. And Bob's here too.
Hi, how you doing?
Can you hear us?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you great. Hey, Bob, how's it going? And I just wanted to ask, are you guys socially distancing yourself from these creatures?
No.
we're going the other direction.
All right, good for you guys.
I think the creatures are doing the social distancing.
Yes, pretty much. Pretty much.
Before we jump in, I wanted to ask a quick question in regards to that, and apologize for kind of interrupting.
That's okay.
I've been when this started, when the pandemic started and the various states went into kind of a, various levels of lockdown. For example, here in Oregon, there was, the traffic really was, reduced considerably. And I spoke with some of the forest rangers, and they were seeing wildlife on the highways or gathered next to the highways that hadn't been seen in their lifetime. And the same thing was going on throughout the country. Have you guys noticed anything like that? Has there been enough of a reduction in vehicle traffic that you're seeing a lot wildlife maybe that you haven't seen before? Their curiosity as they're expanding their territory, that sort of thing.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of deer, in our travels, and we've seen one of our nights we saw a coyote, which was pretty cool. Right near our van. I'll tell you about that one. The thing in traffic as well. The thing that we noticed when we went out, and since we've been going out during this time, is plane. A lot of lack of hearing the planes in the sky, which is, we would hear that several times, at the beginning of our investigations, and then we didn't hear anything, so it was kind of nice.
Agreed.
Not to hear that.
Well, I empathize with the commercial airlines because I'm sure this is having a major economic impact on them. On the other hand, a lack of noise pollution is kind of a nice benefit of all this.
It is. It is nice, to just be able to hear, the forest sounds and the animals and things like that, as opposed to, an 18-wheeler off in the distance. And again, I'm not at all minimizing, the effects of this pandemic on people who need to work. It's unfortunate, really. But again, on the other side of the investigation, it's been pretty quiet.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a bit of an upside from our standpoint. So yeah, So let me ask you. You said you saw a coyote, you saw a deer. Is this a little bit unusual? Is it kind of a benefit, do you think, of the the creatures coming out and sort of investigating the silence from the people?
Probably more than likely. We never saw really a coyote in any of the times that we've been investigating, and this one was pretty close. When we were out there, it was like we heard something kind of running through the woods, and we're like, all right, well, here we go. And it wasn't, it kind of sounded to me like it was a deer, kind of on the lighter side, you know what I'm saying? So we listened and we waited and, kind of were waiting to see if it was coming any closer, if it was going away. And Bob actually turned the headlights on at one point, and right in front of our vehicle there was a looked like a pretty good healthy coyote walking away from us. He didn't seem very nervous or anything. He was just kind of meandering along, and when we turned our lights on, it kind of looked at us, walked at a very slow, easy pace, looked back at us like, you just annoyed me because I think you ran off my dinner. Because the deer and that's what made me feel like a confirmation that it was a deer, that maybe this thing was stalking a deer, and the deer saw that it was getting, closer, heard it coming closer, and then kind of, took off, had that opportunity to take off, because now that, that coyote was a deer in the headlights kind of thing. And he got away. So
there you go.
I don't know if that
deer. That was a benefit for the deer, right?
Benefit for the deer. The coyote was kind of looking at us like, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
So, but again, we've heard coyote plenty of times. Off in the distance, and sometimes fairly close. But we've never really run across them. They've never really come close to us like that. So whether that has anything to do with it, I don't know. But there is a lot of wildlife coming around more lately than usual.
That's great. Okay, so fill us in on what's going on with, because you had some kind of interesting updates with,
Yes.
You guys are conducting your research, and so you've got kind of a baseline of your expectations when you go out, and this is a little bit above that, correct?
Yes, we went out, we went out on May 6th. We've gone out many, many times. And there was, at the beginning of everything, we went out and we were really hearing a whole lot. The last time we talked to you, we had a group chat with Lisa from New York. And that day, I actually broke my leg shortly after I got off the phone with you guys. So that was March 15th, and it was the end of the week is when everything started to, the whole country started to shut down. My husband was laid off, not laid off, furloughed, and I was also furloughed from my job. So not to mention that I had a broken leg, so I wasn't going anywhere anyway. A couple of weeks after that, we started, when I was able to feel comfortable enough to move around better, we started, going out and researching different places around our main research area where we could go and maybe check out, some other places, not very far from the main research area, but like probably like a mile away or so, couple miles away. One was one mile away, one was a couple miles away. That seemed pretty good areas. So we went there a couple times. Nothing happened. We went to our research area, our main research area, and, not a whole lot going on. You hear things off and on. You hear, little twigs snapping and things like that, but that's nothing to write home about. So it could be, again, just, little animals here and there running around. So we were doing that for quite some time, and we went out on, like I said, May 6th, and we had quite a bit of action. We went out with our friend. Was that May 6th or 26th? Actually, that was the 26th. I'm sorry. We went out with our friend, Fred, and he is, oh my gosh, he is so much fun to go out with. I love that guy. He's the one that was in the back seat when we had our runner.
About the vocal?
Yeah, and that was a different one. And we were sitting there outside this time. We decided to go in. We were still social distancing, so usually he comes in our car. We decided to take two cars and have one in back of the other. We were probably a car and a half length apart, and we brought some chairs, and we decided to sit out that night, just to, kind of see what happened. He was a little nervous. We were all on kind of a high alert because of that bluff charge that we had. And, but we sat outside, and we used to do this all the time until we turned it around and did the technique where we stayed in the car and put the listening devices outside of the car so that we weren't interrupting anything, or we weren't, bugging them, and you just wanted to see what was going to come to us. So then that's worked pretty well. So this time we're outside of the car. We all have our listening devices, which are H2s, and just sitting there chatting. We were there for a little while, and probably a good, 15, 20 minutes, and they were talking, and I heard, while they were talking, I was listening out, beyond them and trying to keep track, because these guys can cut up pretty good. And I was trying to keep track of what was around us. So what I heard was a knock. And I said, guys, I just heard a knock. And so, it wasn't that far, but it wasn't that close. And it was kind of a light sounding knock. And I said, so we listened for a little bit, and then we decided to get into the cars. So he took his listening device in his car, we took ours in our car, and we had walkie-talkies, we're talking back and forth to each other to keep in contact. So we got into the cars and settled and everything, and talking back and forth once again. And all of a sudden, what was the first thing we heard? Oh, gosh. I think it was some snapping sounds at first. And kind of, just again, little stuff. Nothing major. And then we started to hear a little more action. We started to hear something moving. And it wasn't running, but it wasn't like walking at a, normal pace. It was weird. It would run and then, or not run, but walk fast and then stop. And then it would walk fast and then stop. And it was doing this like 3 or 4 times. And we're like, what? And Fred is on the walkie saying, uh-oh. And here it comes. I think your friend is back, or something like that. And, so we're listening to this. And I'm like, what? oh, what is it? And it didn't sound like a deer. It sounded heavier than a deer. And it was weird because it would, do that walking, kind of not fast, but, quickly, and then stopping, and then it would walk again. So that was kind of weird. And Bob Bob at one point, he's like, take your flashlight and look out the window. And so I took the flashlight and I started to look out the window. Well, you know how hard it is to look through a window with a flashlight, right? Especially when you have a higher powered flashlight. You get a reflection. So unless you have it right up to the glass. So I'm like, oh. And then in the meantime, while I'm trying to do this, Fred, he walked in and he said, my H2 just died. All right, now he's alone in the car. He's already, sometimes he can be a little nervous and high-strung. And he's like, my H2 just went off. So Bob heard him, but I didn't. I couldn't hear what he was saying because I had my earbuds still in. I'm concentrating on trying to see if I can see anything. And we had turned our lights on, both of us. And, I'm trying to scan the woods. While I'm doing that, he comes in, he chimes in again, and he said, and this time I heard him, I don't know what's going on. My H2 is off, and I can't hear anything. You guys got to tell me what's going on. Now, his H2 went off in almost the height of it, like in the middle of all of this. And I finally heard him, and I was like, what? I'm like, okay. I said, look, I'll let you know what's going on. Just, kind of hang tight. And so I couldn't see through the window. I rolled the window down, and Bob's like, you're rolling the window down? I said, yeah, I want to be able to get out here and see what's going on. So I'm kind of out the window, head, top of my shoulders kind of out the window, scanning the area. Fred's still chiming in. I can't hear a thing. You guys got to let me know what's going on. I said, I'm looking out there. I'm trying to find out, what, if I can see anything. And again, I'm scanning everywhere, and he's just kind of sitting there. So we get, I don't see anything really. I thought I saw a flash of an eye shine, but it was so quick. And then I came, I went back in the car and rolled up the window and just kind of waited. And it was still moving, but not, doing kind of the same thing. I said to Fred, it's still out there. Something's moving. I don't know what it is. Just kind of hang tight. And we couldn't, at this point, I couldn't do anything, for him as far as putting new batteries into his H2. So I just had to keep in contact with him. And he was like, what's going on? I can't hear anything. What's going on? So I'm trying to keep him updated. So we're sitting there for a little bit, and we can still hear it a little. And then it just kind of stopped. And I was like, okay, we don't hear anything.
It didn't walk off.
It didn't walk off. That's the thing. That's the other thing about it. It didn't walk off. What it did was, it just stopped. We didn't hear it. And then every now and again, there would be like twig snaps, and not a whole lot. But then it started to, but it was like every few minutes there would be a movement. But
well,
nothing.
Norma, I'm going to jump in real quick. So this thing, and both of you, did it sound like it was a bipedal, somebody walking, or could it have been a deer, or were you able to, could you make that distinction?
Yeah, it didn't, it was definitely, it sounded bipedal to us. It didn't sound like it was, a light, like a deer is, I don't know. We can usually tell, like when we had that coyote, when we saw that coyote and heard that movement in the woods, we could tell that it wasn't bipedal. We could tell that it was, we surmised that it was an animal and probably a deer. And I had said that, to Bob. Said it just, I mean, it sounds like a deer. It sounds like it's, just kind of walking quickly away as far as like the deer. And then when we turned our headlights on and saw the coyote, it kind of confirmed my thought that it was probably a deer. We've heard other things out there that were on the lighter side that I was like, yeah, it's definitely not something big. So yeah, it sounded bipedal. It sounded heavier, and the weird thing was that it would just kind of move and then stop, and then move and stop.
It was abrupt.
Yeah, it was
almost like it was going from tree to tree or something. It was a and then quick stop, and then the same sound, and then a quick stop. It was very abrupt.
But it wouldn't stop for long. It was almost like it would, like he was saying, it would move to another location and then stop, and then it would move to another location and stop. And it was doing this for, several times. And by the time it finally stopped, and then we were like, okay, but it didn't, when it did stop, it didn't move away. It stayed at the same distance, what it sounded like, the same distance, but it was probably more parallel than anything. It didn't move away. It didn't come closer.
Plus the further activity we got kind of confirms. But
did you guys get the impression that it was either stalking or stealthily kind of sneaking up on you? That's kind of what it sounds like to me, but what are your thoughts?
Well, it's hard to know because, when we got that bluff charge, it was definitely, we could hear it sneaking up on us. Could this have been, in the area when we got there? I mean, very well could have, because before we got into the car, we heard that knock that wasn't that far away. Yeah. And we also had, prior to hearing that kind of movement, stopping and going, we got a pretty good sized rock thrown toward us. And, Fred heard it. He chimed in and he said, did you hear that? And I said, yeah. He goes, sound like a rock. I said, yeah, it sounded like a pretty good sized rock. I mean, we're not talking boulder here. We're talking like, maybe the size of a golf ball or a little bit bigger. You can tell, little tiny rocks as opposed to bigger ones that make more of an impact. And so we heard that prior to this movement that was going, moving and stopping. So that was kind of interesting. And then the knock before that. So what is it? I mean, it's not a deer doing that. It's a deer's not going to, throw something at us. And just like that, when that coyote was in that deer situation, the deer moved away. We could hear it going away. This did not. This stayed in the area. So if you put it all together as far as like that knock beforehand and then the rock that came before the movement started, you have to wonder if this thing was there the whole time, kind of keeping an eye on us and watching us and observing us and whatever. And then when we got into the cars, it started to, do a little bit more. So after the movement, after all of that stopped, we kind of waited and listened. And there were several things that happened. There were pretty good branch snaps that happened off and on. We had things that were kind of thrown at and hit. It actually hit our vehicle, but we don't know what hit the vehicle. Now, either it was, little tiny stones, or I don't even know. Maybe a stick. I don't know, but whatever it was, I know that there a couple times there were rocks because we could hear it kind of skitter across the road, but they were very small. And about 3 or 4 times something hit our van. So, but it wasn't very loud, and it was loud enough so that Fred heard it, and he said, "Was that another rock, or was that a rock that was thrown?" So he was hearing the same thing, and I was hearing it. But again, it wasn't anything that was really big that was, hitting us. And sometimes it would hit us, and sometimes it wouldn't. It would just kind of hit the ground and skitter across. So we were getting that kind of thing. And then we were getting, again, we were getting snaps. There was at one point, there was this high-pitched, like, squeak. You remember that? That high-pitched squeak kind of noise? And I don't have a clue what that was.
Can you give us a quick, real briefly, kind of describe the squeak? Because it sounds like it was out of the norm for you guys.
Well, it wasn't a small, like chipmunk or anything like that. It was a louder, I don't know. I can you describe it? I can't even describe it. And Fred, he's like, what? He's kind of like, what is going on? What is that? It was some kind of a weird noise, high pitched, loud, kind of a squeak or I don't know. I can't explain to it, and I wouldn't even be able to duplicate it. So that was a weird, out of the ordinary, kind of a thing. And again, these snaps, pebbles, there were loud snaps, or it was at one point there was a loud snap that could have been a knock, but hard to distinguish it because it was so, sharp, but not loud. It wasn't really, really loud, but it was louder than all the rest of the little snaps that were going around, like this something was, moving. At one point, there was like a branch that, a little bit louder branch that had snapped. All this stuff that was going on.
Norma, let me ask you real quick. When you said that it was starting and stopping, when you heard that, do you think that it was hunting a deer and that it like recognized you and it maybe viewed you as another competitor? Or like what was the whole thing going on with the starting and stopping?
Well, I don't think that there was a deer out there at that point because we didn't hear anything other than this, whatever this was, this creature. We didn't hear anything else moving around. We didn't hear anything else like shuffling or anything like that. So I highly doubt, and if it wasn't deer, if it was going after anything like that, I think we would have heard, the deer too. And we didn't hear anything going on. And just because of the things that were being thrown and the knock prior to it moving from, moving and stopping like that, we didn't really hear anything but little snaps. And after that, again, these little pebbles would come now and again, and we would hear little twigs breaking, or we would hear louder snaps and things like that. So there wasn't a whole lot of other activity going on when this was happening. What there was at one other point, somewhere around, 20 minutes after that, we heard some kind of a branch or something move or break. And so I looked out the window again and rolled down the window again and started looking out the window. At one point, we had to finally, after everything was happening, we had to finally go out and replace Fred's batteries because he wasn't able to hear anything. But I wanted to make sure that, it was not close. So we had to wait a little while before we could actually get out of the car and, he would get out of the car and we'd change the batteries. And I ended up changing all the batteries and all the H2s. So we had 3 H2s going. So we ended up doing, not to mention, he had to make a nature call. So I wanted to make sure that everything was clear before he went out there, or at least settled down. And there were a couple times when, I had to say, all right, we're waiting, maybe 3 or 4 minutes went by, nothing happened, and then a rock would come. So I was like, you're going to just have to hang tight until, it's safe enough to go out there. And so there was a little lull, and I was so hesitant. I didn't want to break the moment. Do you know you know what I mean? It's like, I don't want to interrupt what is happening here. I don't want it to, go away and say, this is, these people are getting out of the car. Now I'm just going to go. But it didn't do that. So at any rate, we ended up waiting, and then he got out and Bob got out, and, I did all the changing of the batteries, and then we all got settled down again and waited. And sure enough, shortly after that, things started to happen again. We started to hear branches breaking. At one point, there was a pretty good, I'm not saying a gigantic branch, but, a pretty good snap. And then rocks were coming again. So,
wow.
I mean, it hadn't gone away. And at some point, I was a little frustrated because I was worried about, all of our activity might push this thing away. And again, it didn't do that. It stayed and just continued after we got back in the car and settled, just continued to do what it was doing. We heard some louder shuffling at one point, and I think that's what brought me to look out the window again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Just out of curiosity, have there been other, like did you talk to the other people around, your neighbors or people in that area? Had they had any kind of experiences as well, or?
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's what got us
window.
there. Yeah. That's what got us there in the first place. And I had mentioned that, I think, on our first podcast. I had mentioned that that the original thing that had gotten us there was the Bigfoot peeping in the window of this person's house that is actually on the route near, very,
right at the entrance.
It's very close to the entrance to, this area, this road that we go in. And again, Tom has seen the layout of the area, so it's pretty wooded.
Yeah, that was the time. Then we went and investigated the window. It was like 8 feet in the air.
Yeah, the window, from the ground to the window, nothing was underneath the window, and it was about from the lower pane. The head was in the middle of the lower pane of this creature, and it had to have been at least 8 feet tall where we were measuring. So that's what originally got us there. And the same family had a couple sightings that year. So that is what brought us there. Not to mention, we have been in this area for, almost 15 years. We've been researching this particular area. Probably a good 5 years in this one spot that we go to quite often. And we change it up a little bit, but this one spot is our main research area, and we have had so much happen there. And like I said to you, Tom, it's like they just gravitate toward this area. Maybe not the same ones, because we had that, what we thought was a juvenile a couple nights. And then that bluff charge was a little more aggressive. We had that knock that was about 15 feet away from us, and we think we interrupted a hunt on that night. I mean, we've had so much.
There was reports of from a retired officer.
Yep.
They had a white one in the area. They did a full report, and I believe that there was also a report by another gate in that area.
Yeah, there were
a couple reports.
There were quite a few reports in that area. The white one was seen by, I think, 3 different people, but in that area, it's, and I'm saying around that area.
Can you guys elaborate? Sorry to break in. I want to see if you could elaborate a little bit on the reports. By you say by law enforcement as well as people have reported this, seen one.
There was a retired police officer that saw one. It was a white one. There was an older couple on a trail that saw a white one.
Probably the same one.
It was probably the same one. Yeah, it was very, very close. Probably within, I would say, 5 miles of those two sightings. And our area is probably about, probably about what, 20 miles away, which is really nothing. But we haven't seen a white one. So whether it stays in that area or not, I don't know. But there was a few hikers, I think there were two couples who saw the white Bigfoot in that same vicinity. Mm-hmm. And then about 5 miles away is where that police officer saw the white one. So that was just the white one.
I don't believe the lady that had the peeping squatch, if you will, that she didn't report. She just got through to a friend of hers who got through to us that knows that we investigate. So she didn't actually do a full report.
Right. You guys have a kind of a ballpark time. I think what we'd like to do is see if we can get a copy of of those reports.
I'll have to give you that information and see if you can get that
that would
somewhere.
Be good.
But she didn't report it. So again, that was through someone that was a friend of hers, used to go out with us, and he said, hey, and he knew that we did this. So that was around when that happened. That was around 2006, I believe. But it wasn't until 2007 when we actually talked to her.
Right.
And so, and her sighting was not white. It was a darker, like a darker brown.
It kept her out of her bedroom.
Kept her out of her bedroom for a while.
Yeah.
Because she was watching TV and she saw it in the window.
At that time, we weren't aware of any reports either. We were just starting new, and that seemed like a good area because of what happened. And then we learned later on of the reports.
Right. That's when we started to. That's what got us to this area, and that's when we started to do some really good field investigation. I mean, we didn't have anything when we went out there. We had no listening devices. We had nothing as far as electronics to go out with, just our wits and harsh language. That's all we had.
That was questionable.
And we have heard, many things. Bob and I, we talk about this now. We've been, like I said, we've been doing this for almost 15 years, probably total. In this area, almost 15 years. So, when we go out there, we've had things happen many, many, many times. And we think, what were we doing going out without at least being able to really be able to hear, things around us? Because a lot of times, we had no clue. We were just going with our naked hearing, these devices that parabolic mics and things like that people use, I mean, this really gives us a really good advantage.
Yeah.
And just like that bluff charge, we heard it. We heard it coming. We heard it subtly creeping up on us. And we didn't know at the time that, and I said to Bob.
Well, that was the night the tree went down, so we were on edge as it was.
And that was also the night that we didn't hear that growl kind of weird sound that we told you about. We didn't hear it until we heard the H2. And that was in between the tree going down and the bluff charge. Right. It was on the recording, but we didn't hear it while we were listening.
Naked ear for some reason.
Right, when we were listening to the H2. And that kind of blows my mind because I don't understand how that happened. I don't know how we couldn't have heard that. But
frequency, maybe.
Yeah, maybe frequency. I don't know. The H2 definitely picked it up, and when we played it back, we heard it, but we didn't hear it live. So I don't know what that was all about. But
tell them about the Howl.
That was very weird.
We had another outing with some Howls.
Yeah,
I don't know if you want to hear about that.
So, anyways, this whole night at the end of that, whole thing with the movement, it settled down. It just threw things once in a while. But before we left, at the end of the night, there was this very loud pop crack of a branch, and it was a pretty good sized branch. And we were like, whoa, that it was very close. It was within the proximity of where this creature had been hanging out the whole entire time. And man, that was loud. It was loud, and it was like a pop crack kind of a sound. And I'm sure you know what a sound, what a tree sounds like when it breaks off, or a branch or something like that.
Yeah.
But it was very distinctive, but the pop beforehand was very loud, and then that cracking of the branch. And that was right around dawn, right before dawn, when we were about getting ready to, pack it up and leave. And that was the last thing that happened that night. So that was really a very busy, very productive night, which is what we want. But, there are, and I'm not trying to glorify, or making it sound like this stuff happens all the time. There are nights that we go out and there's absolutely nothing going on, and you sit there or you stand there or you're out there for hours and there's absolutely nothing going on. So there are nights where we get we get rushed out of there within 5 minutes of being there. There are nights when we stay there for an hour, and there's a lot going on, and Bob turns the key on and we're going. Or and then there's nights where there's like this, where there's things going on but nothing is trying to get us out of there per se. So those are the nights that we really like. Those are the nights that we really enjoy, because we're listening and we're learning. And I mean, you're always learning when you're out there, and it's so much, I don't know, it's so much fun, but it's
well, the behavioral differences.
Right, the behavioral, that's right. The differences between them that are really cool. Now, we went out another night that prior to this, we went out another night, and shortly after, it was just Bob and I, and shortly after, it was May 6th, and shortly after we got there, we heard some distant kind of things going on. Like, we thought maybe it was an owl or something like that. But it didn't sound like an owl. So this is about maybe 3 minutes into our recording, where we started to hear these howls off in the distance. It wasn't so far off in the distance, like I was talking to you, Tom, about, that it couldn't have come into our immediate area within, a short period of time. So, but Right. We're hearing them. And these are really, I mean, we don't hear vocals often. We hear them every now and again. And I don't know if our Bigfoot are mute or what the deal is. You would think that with all this stuff that's going on, that especially when they're trying to usher us out of there, and you get, a Louisville slugger knock on a tree, you would think that it would vocalize or, yell at us and say, get the heck out of here, kind of a thing. But we don't get a whole lot of that. We get it on occasion. We get it sometimes, and we have had it. But this last May 6th, it was so cool. And so we're listening to this, and all of a sudden, Bob is like, wow, there's something going on out there. And I said, well, what are you hearing? And it started off kind of low, like it wasn't, they weren't being very loud. And then we hear these howls. And it's not an owl. We know what the owls sound like. It's not coyotes. It's a different kind of a howl. It starts off, building up, gets to that climactic point, and then goes down. And this is what it was doing. And it happened in a series of probably three times, the last one being a little bit louder. Then a couple, you kind of hear a little low in between. I think it was like maybe 3 or 4 minutes in between the second time it happened. You can hear kind of a low, just very small, very slight, maybe howl, you know. Didn't know quite what was going on in between. And then it started up again. And it started again with these howls, and then excuse me. And then the last one that we heard was probably like 7 minutes in, or 8 minutes in, and this thing just, it was so strong, and it sounded more powerful, and that was, I think, the last one we heard that was that, you know, louder. It was louder and more strong and powerful, and we were like, wow, that is so that is so powerful, and it's so cool, you know, to be able to hear that. And it was like, it was just, you're almost sitting there and just like, you don't want this to end, you know, kind of a thing. And it was amazing. And we heard a couple things after that, like little, you know, a little shorter kind of howl, but nothing, it was nothing like that really good, strong vocal. But again, at the beginning, there were like 3 of the really good vocals, and then 4 or 5 minutes later, you know, that another couple, but that really nice, clear one that was so, you know, you just knew that it wasn't anything else, you know, out there doing that. So that was amazing. And then also during that, a little while after that, we got a knock. And this thing was, it almost sounded like a gunshot, all right? But this is like, you know, 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, and there's nobody else. Yeah, there were 2, but the first one, it sounded like, well, both of them sounded like a gunshot. And it kind of, it didn't really echo, but it was like, you know, Tom, when I was talking to you about when we had that really sharp knock on the tree, that was only about 15 feet away from us. It was that strong, yeah. But it was further away. It was a little bit, it was further away, but you could hear it. And it sounded like it was the same kind of, strong, powerful knock, same kind of force. But man, it was loud. And I told you about this other woman that had researched, was doing some research. And we listened to some of her recordings that she had. And, you know, we listened to many of her recordings. But there was one night we were listening to it after this, after our incident. And we listened to one of hers, and it sounded almost exactly the same. Just these powerful knocks that were off in the distance that really didn't really have an echo, but, you know, it resonated, you could hear it, you know. So it was really cool. And then we got another one a little while after that. A different area, a different distance, yeah.
Do you know if because you told me a little bit about this lady that had done some research, and do you know if she was in the Northeast or what region of the country she's located in?
Yeah.
Northern Massachusetts.
Northern Mass in southern New Hampshire. So right along, right along the northern, it would probably be in the middle of the northern part of Massachusetts into over the border into New Hampshire. That's about the area that she was researching.
Right.
Which
and
we
so
know
as far
the
as
area.
These creatures, yeah. So as far as these creatures are concerned, I mean, you're in the same area.
Yeah. There's corridors all over.
Yeah. There's so much forest around here. I did a talk at a library one time, and it was, you know, Massachusetts isn't that big of a state, but it borders
Vermont,
Vermont and New Hampshire, New York, the western part, all these areas that are there's so much forest. And if you look up Massachusetts and how much forested area is in Massachusetts, you'd be amazed at how much acreage we have that is land protected, state forests, things like that. And it's just amazing. And up in this area, we're in the western part of Massachusetts. And so this area in east of us, when you stay in the northern part of Massachusetts, it's just very, very forested. Smaller towns, a lot of area to roam for these creatures. In quarters. I mean, they travel, very easily through these wooded areas, through these forests. So, I'm not surprised of where, her recording. I wish I knew exactly where they were because I would love to pick up, where she left off.
Yeah, she passed on.
Yeah, she passed away, which is last year, which is unfortunate. But she was very, she pretty much kept to herself, and she let everybody know what was going on, and she loved this research.
It's funny how similar we didn't know her, but her search techniques were very similar to what we picked up, and we never saw her videos. We just were almost researching the same way.
And I'm telling you, this woman, man, she had some guts. The stuff that was going on with her, I mean, she had, she would go out, in the middle of the night by herself, and she would hear, the stuff going on, which was pretty amazing, the stuff that she was recording. And she would actually go out there and leave recorders out overnight.
Yeah, that's what she did. She spread out recorders.
And then she would pick them up, and she would, listen to them and put the good stuff on, YouTube, on her YouTube channel. So, I mean, some amazing stuff. Some of it you knew, was probably coyote or probably something like that. During her beginning, investigations. Yeah. But man, I'll tell you, some of the stuff there. We don't know how she would stay. She would sleep in her truck,
Well, there were times she said she hid under her blanket. Yeah. She wrote, "I'm hiding under my blanket."
Now, Bob can relate to that, you see.
No, I just turn the key and go.
Yeah, he just turns the key and go because, like Will said, he doesn't want to be a sack lunch.
Right.
Where I'm trying to put my foot over to the brake and get the car to stop. Come on, Bob. Fuck up there.
Yeah, don't be the sack lunch, or if you're going to be, take a ham sandwich with you.
Good advice.
No, I mean, there are nights like we had, on the 6th and on the 26th that you don't want those nights to end. And then there are other nights where you get the bluff charge and you're like, I am not going back. I mean, since the bluff charge, every time that we get close to our area and get close to this exact same place, we feel that kind of rise in our chest, like, this could happen again, and I mean, nothing happened, the creature stopped, but... Well,
probably because you threw the light on it.
Probably because, I put the light on it, but...
That's when you saw the eye, the amber eye.
And yeah, but, what would have happened? I mean, I don't know. I mean, these things could roll our vehicle, and without a problem. It could knock it over, put us on our side. Or
the insurance company would love that commercial.
Yeah, like I said, we'd have to have some kind of, insurance that would accept this.
Hey, Norma and Bob.
You were rolled by what?
Oh, let me just ask you, how fast was that charge towards you guys?
Well, like I said, it was creeping up on us. We call it the sneaker or the creeper. It was.
Well, it turned into a bluff charge.
Yeah, it turned into a bluff charge.
Little snaps for an extended period of time.
And Bob wasn't hearing some of them, and I was saying, well, it must be on my side because I didn't. I was hearing the subtleties of this thing creeping, and toward the end, I said there were a little bit, maybe a louder snap here or there, and I said, "Did you hear that?" And he said, "Yeah, I heard that." And then shortly after that, this thing just went from a dead stop, to wherever it was, to charging at us.
Up and just, well,
charged at
it
us.
just sounded like a really good, solid pace, not caring about trees or saplings. It just...
Once it started,
it
was running at us.
No, running, good pace.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to say, but it just was snapping everything.
And that's when Bob threw the flashlight at me and said, "Look out your window." And, when I did that and I saw that eye shine by the tree, it was...
Like 40 feet away.
Yeah, within a distance. I mean, 30 to 40 feet, and 40 is probably stretching it. So it was right by a group of trees that I see every time I go there, and I remember what I saw, but it was behind it, and all I could see was the eye shine. So, I mean, this thing, it did stop, and I saw it a couple times. It stayed in that area as we were leaving. Bob left rubber behind us, and as we were leaving, I looked back, and it was in that same spot that I had seen where it stopped the first time. So, that's what those kind of things kind of creep you out a little bit. But I tried to get Bob to go back, but he wouldn't. There was no getting him back there. That night, but like I said, every time we go back there, and generally it doesn't happen, and it never really did with me unless something drastic happened. But usually I'm not really apprehensive. But when we had that bluff charge, now I kind of, I don't know if you guys know, but you kind of feel that welling up, and you're like, this, is this going to happen again? I mean, we were out there one night, and we within this pandemic, we were out there one night, and we could hear these subtle things happening. We could hear subtle snaps, and I said to Bob, "Oh, this is just way too familiar. This is way too familiar."
Yeah, but to be honest, the first time we heard those little snaps, we didn't think Bigfoot.
No.
We heard the tree go down, but then those little snaps could be anything. So we don't, like you said, we don't go right to Bigfoot. So we try to be very cautious of what we're listening to.
And it didn't dawn on us until after the bluff charge, and after
until it turned it up.
Right,
we didn't know really what
it started running at us and did the bluff charge. We didn't we realized after that what we were hearing, and I even said to Bob, there is something moving out there. There is something, on my side. And sure enough, it came out of the woods like a freight train toward us. So that was, it was kind of startling, but cool at the same time.
I'm going to back up. Oh, I just want to back up for a second. Okay, so you saw this, and also the one that the reports, with the law enforcement, where they got the reports on these things. Are you guys familiar with the basic different types of Sasquatch, and what do you think might be the one that's most prevalent up in your area, up in the Northeast?
Well, that's a good question.
I'm going to jump in and say I think it's the one that's probably the most common, and we've been talking to people down on other areas of the East Coast. Actually, not too far from where you're located. Type 4s, which are actually quite a bit different than the other three. Type 1s, Type 2s, and Type 3s are similar to the other ones, except they have more of a kind of a baboon type of snout.
Let me jump in there a minute, Tom. The Type 4s, and it goes by description. If you get descriptions of them seen pretty much devoid of facial hair, that's what Tom's talking about, the Type 4s.
I think that is
the one that Pete saw was a lot of hair. Remember the...
No, not his face, though. Not his face. Okay. I think that's the type that we have around here, because the woman that saw it in her window, pretty much described it that way. And other I believe other reports around there, like the minister that we, had interviewed that saw it in Holyoke at the Mount Town region, again, was very much like that. I don't think there's any kind of baboon type things, that people have seen around here.
Yeah, that's pretty much outside of your area, Norma. Some pictures. The Minnesota Iceman, that many people are familiar with, was a good example of the Type 4. And also, Deloy's ape in South America is very close in appearance to the Minnesota Iceman. So we're going to put those images on the website so people can take a look at that. And Tom and I were discussing it quite a bit yesterday. So that's really, folks, if you're in that part of the country in the northeast, from the northeastern, get my geography here, the Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, eastward and north, that's kind of the primary area for the Type 4s. But that's the distinguishing characteristics is they are pretty much devoid of facial hair, whereas the other types have a lot of facial hair.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense around here because I've seen a lot of, different, what would they call it, drawings that people have made of the area of the Bigfoots that are around here. I say Bigfoots, I hate that word. That are around here. So, I mean, we had a friend who saw one in New Hampshire, and he had a picture drawn of it, and it's exactly like that. So I don't think anything that I'm aware of, anything other than that in this area. But, there are people still that don't report it. So, I mean, who knows? But I really don't think there's any other, description than that.
Norma, Bob, we really appreciate the update, and keep us posted so we can have you back on when things occur there.
Sure. Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
It was an honor.
So much fun.
All right. Thank you, folks. Welcome back from the break, everyone. We thought we'd just do kind of a mixed segment here with questions, comments from the YouTube page, and just general discussion. Tom, where do you think we ought to start?
You know what? We got a guy here in Australia he's got a real good question. A gentleman named Tony. Excuse me. He says, Will, when you had your first encounter with one of these creatures, how did it react to your presence? And how would you best describe your emotional state afterwards?
Tony, those are a couple of good questions. It didn't really do much. It stopped moving and just sort of stared at me. And I'm sure it was very apprehensive. Beyond that, I don't know, because it didn't really exhibit any kind of behavior other than just standing there staring at me. Even when I shot in the air and the other one come walking around to the first one, and the second one basically did the same. It took up the same posture the first one did. And it wasn't really an aggressive posture. It wasn't a defensive posture. They just were standing there staring at me. So I took off running. And my mental state after that was, I wouldn't say confusion. It was just there were so many questions in my mind. And it's been that way all these years. I don't think my outlook has really changed that much from that moment.
I'm curious, because I think I heard you mention one time they stared at you with like a soul-piercing stare. It was not a comfortable...
It wasn't comfortable. It was actually a very unpleasant... it was. I felt like they were glaring at me. Now, whether they were or not, but it made me feel that way.
Right. And I don't think I can recall a single witness that we've interviewed who said, it was I really enjoyed that experience.
Yeah, I've never heard anybody say, it was really a soul uplifting moment.
Uplifting moment. And I really look forward to another encounter like that. Uh, everybody, to a T, has said, sense of doom, dread, terror. I want to get out of here. I wish I'd never been here.
And historically, that's usually the type of comments that are made. I mean, as far back as you can go in history, that where there are written accounts.
So, yeah, very.
Yeah, so you know, definitely feeling the need to change your underwear is right up there on the list.
I bet. What I'm going to ask you this. I may have asked before, but I'm curious. What kind of eyes did you get a chance to really? I mean, they animal eyes? Are they brown? You know, what did they look like?
They were probably brown. I mean, like I said, it was dusk. Light wasn't really great. I mean, I could see them pretty clearly, the creatures, but there were shafts of light coming in the lower part of its body, so I saw the feet very well. Lots of detail there. As you moved up, there was a lot of shading, so I could see their eyes. They weren't human-like eyes. I guess I would characterize them as more animalistic, but not really animal either. And I don't know how to describe that any differently.
Right. So if somebody wants to see that for themselves, they need to see it for themselves, and then they'll understand, right?
Right. I guess I would say to me, I didn't get the animal impression because they were so large, the eyes. And I think that's what made the difference, at least to me.
Oh, okay.
You know, because when you look at animal eyes, usually they're smaller eyes.
Correct.
And kind of blend in a lot of times with fur or hair. And this creature's eyes weren't quite like that. They were very large.
Oh,
okay. They were deep set. And that kind of obscured the vision a little bit too because of how, you know, kind of set in they were.
So if they're deep set, does this thing have like a brow ridge, like a heavy brow ridge?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay. Brooding, glaring.
It was
thing.
It was a heavy brow ridge, and it had the conical shaped head, you know, like what you see in a Patterson film. Hair wasn't, I wouldn't say long. It was probably, and I didn't notice a difference. And again, lighting wasn't conducive to this. So, as far as the hair being a different length than the rest of the body, because to me, I mean, like I said, this only happened in moments anyway. So I wasn't taking stock of all these details. But the hair looked like it was about 6 inches long all over its body. Mm-hmm. And it looked fairly uniform to me, but again, I wasn't really focusing on that. I mean, it was a what the hell moment, and you know, in moments trying to figure out what I was going to do.
Yeah, right. Last question on that: were you able to detect any kind of coloration? Were they reddish? Were they black? What were they?
The eyes just dark.
Okay, yeah, but I mean the hair.
Oh, the hair. The hair was brown. It was dark brown.
Oh, it was.
I could see that, sure. But there were a few lighter strands. There were lighter brown strands mixed in here and there. Not a lot, but I did see that in the light. I mean, the one detail I did see where the light was shining, because the foot was moving, its right foot and lower leg. And I got a pretty good look at that, you know, those details, and that's what the hair looked like. And it wasn't well groomed. It was, I wouldn't say, you could say matted. It wasn't really matted. But it wasn't groomed. We could tell it had gone through brush because there were little pieces of twigs and things in it.
Okay. Very interesting.
And it wasn't straight hair. There were parts of it that were, I wouldn't say wavy, but a little wavy. You know what I mean?
Oh, okay.
It wasn't like it was combed or anything.
Yeah, right. I mean, I'm sure they don't do that. What about the second one? You saw one, 3 years after this, right?
14 years later, the gray one?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the first encounter was 1974. The second one was 1988.
Oh, okay. So quite a bit. All right.
Quite a bit later, yeah.
And what did that one, what can you say about that? Did you get any features or?
It had its back turned to us. It was interesting. That was the hair didn't appear as long as the first two that I saw, and they were pretty close to each other in terms of appearance. Just size difference was the thing I noticed. Now, there could have been differences, but the other one came around not in any kind of shafts of light, so to me it appeared like the other one. Now, this one in southern Washington, this gray one, the hair appeared to be a little shorter. Again, like what you see in the Patterson film, the hair looks fairly short. It was like that. And you could tell a little bit more definition. In other words, you could see where the spinal column was on its back and shoulder blades as it moved. It was a lot bigger than the first two. And of course, the light grayish color.
Right.
But the head.
What about definition?
The head and everything had the same shape as the other two. I mean, it had that conical head. Definition-wise, what do you mean as far as?
Oh, like a lot of people describe, they could see the muscular definition, just these massive muscles. It just says massive.
I didn't really notice that. It was. Let me think. No, you really couldn't tell that. I mean, you could see how big it was. Its dimensions were huge. It was probably, and I found tracks of that one later. They were 18 inches long, so it would have made a little over 9 feet tall, which is, we estimated 9-10 feet, so it was in that range. Very squared kind of shoulders. They were very wide. Like I said, it was much bigger than the first one I saw. And but there you couldn't tell muscle definition.
Yeah. Okay. And if I remember right, it was across a river.
Yeah, it was about 100 feet away.
Oh, okay. That's actually pretty close.
Not super far. Yeah, the river wasn't real wide. It's probably, I don't know, 60 feet across there, and we were right at the one edge, and it was just on the other bank.
And this is in the daytime, correct?
In the daytime, yeah, mid-afternoon.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Okay, so we got one here. This is from Janine. And Janine wants to know, she says, speaking of James and Tammy, are they still having issues? Their encounters were so interesting to hear. And she said there's no comparison to sitting here listening to what had happened. Have we heard from them? Do we have any updates on James and Tammy?
I haven't heard from them. I'll have to reach out to them and see if there's anything going on. We get caught up doing so much else. Sometimes it's hard to get back in touch with people. Some people we lose contact with, but I can get a hold of James and Tammy and see if we can get an update.
And I think I mispronounced her name. I think it's Jeannie. I hope I'm doing that right. And Jeannie, I'm with you 100%. I listened to their very first episode, and it was absolutely riveting. I mean, the creatures on the roof, the whole thing. It was just very, very interesting, a very wild situation.
It was, for sure.
And my favorite part, Will, I think this is yours too, where the two different groups met.
Well, the two types.
Two types, yes. And they had mutual disgust for each other? Or?
Well, the one was disgusted. The other two made a hasty about face and left. So I don't know. I don't think it was mutual necessarily. I think there was disgust on one side and fear on the other.
Now that is interesting that you're going to have a Bigfoot scaring off a couple of others. They're like, we got other things to do besides this. So, yeah, Jeannie, thank you for that. So one gentleman comments, he said, I'll just read this real quick. He says, I don't know. If it takes more than 30 minutes to field dress a deer in some areas, you might be in trouble. I've never killed an elk, so I'm not sure how long that would take. Well, when I'm thinking of, because I've field dressed deer before, and I'm thinking of the whole thing, of taking the guts out and getting the legs tied, and then you got to get the skin off and everything. Getting that skin off is and I've done cattle as well, it's very time consuming. Oh, yeah. Exceptionally time consuming. And an elk is like doing a cow or cattle.
Yeah. And then you have to quarter it.
Exactly.
With an elk, and so it's very time consuming, sure.
Right. And I worked on a ranch. We had a professional come out with a slaughter truck, and they would tie it up. And it was a lengthy process with a professional doing it.
Yeah.
I think it was a couple hours.
Sure. And you're not in a big rush most of the time. I mean, I understand what he's saying. Sometimes you might be in a hurry because of darkness is setting in or whatever, but I know plenty of guys that have, we talked to one Dalton, in fact, stayed with his deer all night because he didn't want to pack it out in the darkness.
Right. And he did that, remember?
He did.
Or it was an elk. He did that on a mountain where he knew these creatures were.
He did, yes. And he built 3 fires around himself.
Right? So there's a lot of faith in those fires, let me tell you.
Yeah, I've put my faith in them before, and they didn't let us down, so...
Yeah,
at least that was our perception, anyhow.
Well, there's some good information. So, I
think there's a reason early man built fire and stuck to it. Besides
right?
eating cooking.
Exactly. But I can't imagine sleeping. That's an oxymoron to me. Sleeping on a mountain, fires or no, with these creatures around.
Well, he's got a pretty tough background, so...
Yeah, he does. Yeah. Rich wants to know. He says, another great show, so thank you, Rich. He says, you guys rock. He goes, I asked Jess for the heck of it, what would win, Siberian tiger or lion against a Sasquatch? And you guys answered me, so thank you for that. He says, now he's going to ask, how about an 18-foot python versus a Sasquatch? Who do you think would win that battle? And Rich, I'm going to take it. Let's make it a 25-foot python or any size python. Okay, let's just make this thing enormous. Will, what's your thoughts?
Well, as we talked before we came back on the segment, if we think there'd be some shoes and Bigfoot purses made.
Right, exactly.
In all seriousness, though, typically you're not going to find one of these things just out wandering out all by itself. The other ones are going to be relatively close by. So if one got in trouble, you'd have the other ones coming to its aid fairly quickly. So I think the snake would definitely be on the menu.
Yeah. And again, that would be a group effort at any point.
And with their strength, all I do is have to do is get a hold of its head and it'd be crushed in a moment.
Yep, and snap it right off.
You can snap 2 and 3 and 4 inch thick trees with no problem. I'm sure a snake or an animal would be nothing.
Right. And there's evidence that they may even do much larger trees and pulling them out of the ground. Pulling a tree, even a sapling, out of the ground with the root system. Right. I mean, I tried pulling some weeds out, and they're pretty tenacious. So a tree would just be the strength of that, and the breaking strength of a 3-inch, 3.5-inch, 4-inch fir tree is just incredible.
Yeah, I'd still like to know what the strength, the amount of pressure would be to do that.
So if there's any mechanical engineers out there or somebody with a background in any kind of engineering that can weigh in on this, what the breaking strength is of a live tree, whether deciduous or conifer, we'd like to hear from you. Okay, here's a real good one. Robert wants to know, he says, I like your theory about the baiting. And you and I talked with another gentleman earlier today about that. Mm-hmm. And that's always a good subject to kind of elaborate on. We have, or actually you have a picture of a deer.
Right.
That's about 15 feet up a tree.
11 feet up the tree, yeah.
11 feet up the tree. We know that bears don't do that, and mountain lions don't do it. Mountain lions, there's no reason to do it. What can you comment about that?
Well, and again, you brought that up about mountain lions not doing it, and it's the first thing people would go to because we see all this stuff on television with big African cats that do things like that. A cougar weighs about the same as, at least in the Northwest, as some of the deer do. So they're not able to carry an animal like it up the tree, and really don't need to, but they'll lightly bury their kills and then come back and eat more later. In that particular picture we're talking about comes from the Adirondack Mountains, and that same tree was used for the same purpose different years. So the creatures would hang a deer up in that tree, and of course my thinking was baiting. Why else would you do that? So you're more than maximizing. You could have a nice meal with one deer, but then you got to go out and expend the energy to get another one. So if you could attract other animals to that site for a while, not indefinitely, of course, because you'd want to eat that eventually, and I'm sure that's what happened. But if you could bring in some more kills, by sitting around and just waiting, why not?
Yeah, and we've actually, it's a common occurrence with these creatures. It's not just deer, but there's times when, Dawn in Maine has found the deer skulls just sitting on a rock.
And you found one too.
And I found one. And your comment made me feel really, really good. That had I been there alone.
Well, the important thing about that too is it wasn't chewed on or anything, and it was totally intact with the antlers in your case.
Yes, yeah, it was very pristine.
And that's kind of unusual in nature.
It is, and it looked like it had been bleached, and it was. Let me tell you, that area, to just driving to that area was a challenge because you had to go through some places on the road where, frankly, I got quite a bit of pinstriping on my truck. And then hiking down to this lake. You would never know the lake was there until you get within less than 100 feet of the lake because the foliage was so thick, the trees and everything. And then we hiked all the way around the lake. And the area where we found it, there was no trails. We were just thrashing through the brush trying to get to the other side. So it was, this long-winded way of saying it wasn't put there by a person.
Refresh my memory too. Wasn't it sitting on a rock?
I thought it was sitting on a rock, and I actually there was a lady that was with us. She wanted to keep it. I said, yeah, it's all yours. Go for it. Mm-hmm. She thought it was laying in some berry bushes. So I honestly don't know. I don't recall. I thought it was sitting on a rock.
Okay.
But what I do recall is it was by itself. There's no other carcass around. There's no hide. There's no hooves. There's nothing. Just out in the middle of nowhere where nobody would find it is this, deer skull with perfect antlers.
A lot of times, especially if the antlers are still on, a lot of times you'll find the hair, where the rest of the carcass is rotted away, what was left.
Right.
I've seen that quite a few times, but that's interesting that it was unusual with both the antlers still on the skull, and the skull was in pristine condition.
It's as if it was just zapped in there.
Right.
It was pretty interesting. So I don't know, it certainly looks like baiting. It sounds like it. And by the way, that area is the exact same area where we found 14-inch footprints. And we've heard a lot of vocalizations. Mm-hmm. And I talked to somebody who was in a position of authority who said there's a lot of them up there. So it all kind of adds up.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we got somebody here who says, I have a question. What do you think of these documentaries like Expedition Bigfoot, etc., even the ones with high expectations? Okay, this person wants to know, are they censored by the powers that be? What can they show? What proof? and is the reason why some of these documentaries or show end with no result proof for videos. And I think we know it's the way they do it.
I can be blunt. The fact of these people talk and act like they know a lot, but they don't know anything. That's why they don't find anything. There's plenty of evidence out there. If you know what you're doing, you can find it.
That's exactly true.
Some people may not want to hear that, but that's the truth.
And I don't know. Yeah, exactly. It's
and these shows are entertainment. They're not. They promote themselves like they're going to really do something, but in Finding Bigfoot, you never saw anything. And personally, I think that was a very silly show. Especially going out smacking on trees and making a bunch of noise and everything. You're never going to attract any wildlife doing that, ever. In this other show, it's not much different. It's like Finding Bigfoot 2.0.
Right. And I'm just going to... The only thing you saw on the show was a lot of green faces, green trees, green lights, and absolutely zero Bigfoot.
Right.
And I was, you sit there and you watch it, you go, I got an idea. Why don't one of you go out there with minimal camera equipment and go look for one of these things? But it said there's always an entourage.
Right, yeah. Again,
and they talk quietly. I'm like, oh, you fooled them. Okay.
When there's 10 people around there, yeah, right. What are you talking quietly for? They already know you're there if they're in the area. So talking quietly is irrelevant.
Yeah. And, when you drive into the woods, my buddy and I have talked about this, the moment you slam your door shut or even close it, everything within 4 miles knows that you're there.
Oh, yeah.
All ears perk up. Okay, everybody's on high alert.
Even people. I've been out, in areas and had other people coming back to the camp and even across the river one time. And the first thing I noticed was the car door shut. You could hear that hundreds of yards away. And it's that metallic sound. It's like with animals and the safety on a gun. We talked before a couple of times about my dad. One of the first things he taught me with hunting was to take the safety off before I run into an animal to shoot, because just that noise, that little click, can make a deer bolt.
It's an unnatural noise.
It doesn't belong there, sure.
No, it's a metallic noise. I'll tell you this is kind of embarrassing, but my buddy and I, this is when I was probably 20, a friend of mine and I were deer hunting, and we'd spent literally half the day stalking this one deer in the mountains, deep through the woods, and you'd hear it crunching, and you'd stalk it, and you'd wait. And at the last moment, it came out into the clearing and looked at us. And he had a Remington 243. He picks it up, and he pulls the trigger, and it goes click. Oh, oops. Probably need to, work the bolt and get around in there. He did, and we ended up getting it, but that was embarrassing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Got perfect shot, perfectly aimed, and then
that's it.
Click. Yeah. That would definitely be the exception to the rule.
And I can even remember, in the Army, we'd take the guys out on patrol, and we'd tell them, to move the selector switch off safe to whichever mode we were using before we got to our objective point where we were going to kick off whatever operation we were doing, so that an opposing group would not hear that noise, even though on an M16 it wasn't that loud. But still, you want to try to minimize any kind of a noise that would give your position away.
Absolutely. And I would imagine in that situation, the opposing, your enemy is going to be on high alert. Any sound like that might bring some hot lead your direction.
Exactly, yeah.
A prolonged amount of it.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another one. This is also Tony from Australia, and this is a good one. Thank you, Tony. He said, I would love to hear how, why, and when the panel got interested in Sasquatch. My moment was after watching that Patterson film as a child.
He wants to know when we got interested?
I think that, so you and I, the panel, I guess, when we know when you got interested, right?
Right, yeah, back in 1972.
It was an involuntary
It was.
thing.
It was unexpected.
Right. Well, I got to say that for me, it was, I was really ambivalent about the whole thing for, most of my life. And I really don't, I think I was probably a skeptic. I just didn't believe in it. But there came a point when I started to look at the evidence, and I was like, hey, wait a second, that cannot be fabricated. And there was a tipping point. So then I was really interested, but it didn't take me anywhere until December of 2017. And I was getting a Christmas tree, and that's when I had that encounter where, probably, 10 or 12 yards away, one of these things whistled sharply. At nighttime, we're pulling the chains off the truck. And that's when I got a hold of you. And it was about 2 weeks after I heard that whistle that I'd gone through process of elimination to try to decide, what it could possibly be. And there's just nothing. There wasn't a bird. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a marmot. It was either a person with the ability to make a very loud whistle, or it was one of these creatures. And it was obviously one of these creatures.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's an interesting comment from Brooke Williams. I live in Georgia, and I remember my grandma told me to stay in the firelight and I would be fine. When I asked what was that noise after hearing one scream one night camping when I was little, all the other adults laughed a little, and my granddaddy said, the boogeyman won't mess with you on the light. I didn't think anything about it until years later. Now I know what the real booger is. Monsters are real. All the folks. I guess she was just saying that all the people there knew about it.
Oh, okay. And this was in Georgia?
In Georgia, yeah.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. And they do. I mean, the Deep South we get a lot of reports out of Georgia and up into Tennessee and all over, Florida.
We've mentioned this before too. There's another one. This great interview with the guy. I wish we could see the pictures he's talking about. Structures, rocks and tracks. It's from episode 62. Those are either going to be on the website, folks, or in the newsletter. The website's limited as far as what we can put in there, so the rest will go in the newsletter that comes out each month. And you can get that either on my website or creekdevil.com.
And if that's episode 62, I'll go back and I'll double check. As long as the images have been provided to us, then we'll put those up there. So sometimes we don't always get it, we don't always get the imagery. And but actually looking at, I'm on the website now, and so the images are up there. So the trackway and the structures and the footprints are now up on the website, creekdevil.com. But that brings up another good point, Will, and that is, I've got to say that a lot of our, you mentioned a moment ago that, there's a lot of evidence out there, and we've heard it said it's, their evidence that these creatures are hiding in plain sight. And that's true because we get a lot of, more and more, we're getting, people are getting pictures of the footprints, the tracks, episode 66 with the, down below I put the torn up elk pictures down there. Those are great evidence, great pictures.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, by all means, keep those coming. And, I want to mention something. When we had Larry Batson on a couple episodes back, he said something that was real interesting, and that is he thinks there's probably even some better footage out there than the Patterson-Gimlin film that people simply haven't released and probably never will release, simply because they don't want the attention. Maybe it was at a favorite hunting lodge, maybe it was on their own property.
Right.
Yeah, and the last thing they want is a crowd.
I agree. That's my belief also, because I've gotten pictures like the Michigan photo, and we did get another film, and I don't know that anything's been updated with that film from it's in the Columbia River Gorge area. I can't remember exactly where. Supposedly, a group of Sasquatches killing and eating a bear, but I looked at the video and it was in really bad shape, and I couldn't make out a lot from it. We have a friend who was trying to do some work with it. He said he did get some stills, but he's a doctor, so you can imagine he's been very busy. So when things slow down for him a little bit, I'll see what I can find out if we get an update on that. But that's my opinion too. I mean, and I've said it for a long time that there probably are a lot of pictures out there, very good ones, not just stills, probably some film. In the case of the film I mentioned, that was a videotape, and it's set for 20 years in the guy's house until a friend of ours' father asked him about that and asked if we could see that, and he gave his permission. So, things degrade quite a bit, especially older technology, over that amount of time.
Yeah, that's true. Videotape does. It used to be in the days of yore. I used to do electronic repair and electronic work 100 years ago. Maybe not quite that long, but
it feels like it's though, right?
It feels like it. And the thing with the videotape and audio tape was to keep it in good condition, you would have to periodically put it in the machine and fast forward all the way to the end, and then rewind it so that it doesn't stick. Otherwise, the tape kind of deteriorates and it sticks against itself, and you get little gaps in the audio or the video quality. So just if it was a videotape, that would explain part of the reason why it may not have been great quality.
Yeah, it was an older VHS, so.
And, the other thing is we hear comments about, well, how come we don't get more video from everybody's got a cell phone? Well, two things. Number one, if it's close by, the last thing on your mind is digging out your cell phone, right? And if it is far enough away, cell phones, with all due respect, they don't have the clarity. It's a very small aperture. They just don't have the, doesn't matter how many megapixels it is, the lens is just really small, so it doesn't gather that much information.
I can tell you from standing in front of one of these things, the last thing in your mind is to go do anything except get the hell out of there. I had a rifle in my hands, and that was just, it was like, oh, let me see if I can shoot in the air. I wasn't even thinking about the gun. You don't have the presence of mind in something like that. It brings so much fear. I mean, it takes you right down to your core. And the last thing you're thinking about is, oh, I'm going to pull a camera out and take a picture of this thing. Doesn't happen.
Not at all. And guess what? Here's what I've told people many times, and that is, you don't need that picture isn't for you. You don't need a picture to confirm that what's in front of you is in front of you. That picture is for somebody else, right? To ostensibly to prove that this thing's there.
Yeah, if you see it, you know what you saw.
You know what you saw. And like you said, you just want to get out of there. Maybe you can live another day and tell somebody about it. But I can only imagine even if you did have the presence of mind to grab something, put it in your hand, and then point it at them.
Yeah. Not
they may react in a very negative way if they're close by.
And even when I had my rifle, I never pointed it at the creature. It was, I guess in military terms, it was sort of in a port arms, kind of how I was holding it. and I just kind of raised the barrel up a little bit and shot in the air. Never pointed it at the creature at all.
Right. And very possibly that's why we're talking about it now.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Reed Morris asks the question, is a Bigfoot's legs actually short, or actually that short relative to its arms? He's looking at one of Guido's sketches from episode 66. Actually, the proportions are a little bit different in both the legs and the arms compared to humans. In the Sasquatch, the thigh is longer and the shin bone is a little bit shorter, where with us it looks like it's more even. And their forearms are longer, which gives that impression that they're hanging, much longer arms than ours.
So they do have, because we've actually heard some people talk about, they've described their arms to the point where actually the fingers of this creature go down to its knees.
Yeah, part of it's because their shoulders are kind of slumped a lot of times. And when you look at the Patterson Sasquatch, that one is sort of that way, and maybe it's with the females it's like that. I don't know, because the ones I saw, I'm pretty sure were all males, and they didn't have as what's often described as the slumped shoulders as much. They were a little more squared, but I think that's because the males, the center of gravity is higher in their body than is the females. But
the creatures also walk with a bent knee as well.
They
so
do.
That would.
So the arms would come down lower.
Yeah. But I think in general, their physiology, their arms probably a little bit longer than ours. Proportional, wouldn't you think? Or
yeah, probably.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question.
But yeah, they're a different species, so their arms and legs are built differently than ours.
Okay, yeah. So they do have now also we were talking about this the other day. The construction of their feet between the four different types. There seems to be some variance between the type 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Well, when you and I were talking about that, I have a bunch of footprint cast leg on a table on my desk. I'm out of room, so the rest of them are in drawers. But just the ones that are sitting around here, we were talking about when John Napier, mentioned in his 1970, I think, book, or 72 book titled Bigfoot. And in there he talked about, based on footprint morphology, that they felt at that time, in the early 70s, that there were two different types of footprints, indicating that there were two different types of creatures, or possibly two species. And of course, what I was told, there are two major groupings with two subgroupings in there, but there are actually up to 22 variations of all of these. So when you look at the footprints, when I looked at the ones I have here, I could see three different types of morphology among these casts. So which groups those belong to? Well, actually two of them are found in the Northwest here. One of them was in North Carolina. So, which of those, out of those four groupings, we don't know, of course, but you can identify some morphological differences in the feet, which would lend itself to, the various types.
The other thing I found interesting was we got a gentleman who's coming up on a future episode, and him and his wife are camping in the Sierras in California, and they ran into that juvenile footprint, which I thought is kind of cool. It's this kind of a like a wedge-shaped foot.
Actually, there were a couple of footprints in that picture.
Yes, there were, and you take a look at them. Superficially, they kind of resemble human feet, but you can tell right off the bat this is not a person.
Yeah,
almost like a duck foot.
Yeah, it was very interesting, and it's similar to some of the tracks I have casts of. except those are juvenile prints.
Right.
And he says he wears a size 10 shoe, and they were comparable in length to his shoe.
That's right. Now you have some even smaller. You have is it a cast or a picture? You've got some really small juvenile.
Oh no, I've got a cast that a friend in Washington sent him and his wife found, and it's only about 3 inches long. It was found on the backside of a lake, and there were adult 15-inch Sasquatch tracks about 10 feet away.
Oh, okay, so that definitely rules out a person.
Well, and the location too. I mean, and for it would have to have been an infant foot, and there's no infant that's just going to walk in the mud on the backside of a lake without assistance.
Yeah.
And this was a line of tracks all by itself.
Oh, okay, yeah. Very interesting.
I guess we can probably put some of the pictures up there of the differences between some of these tracks on the website.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll create a spot and put them up there because, I just think it's a good visual comparison between the different types.
And I've even got a picture. People for years they would say, somebody'd say found these tracks, and then they'd say, "Oh, you found bear tracks." And I've got pictures I've taken of my own casts that I've made of bear tracks and overlapping bear tracks and Bigfoot tracks. So we can put some of those up there so people can actually see the difference, not just size, but the shape and everything.
Yeah, that's a good point, because how often do we hear, typically it's always from skeptics, that, well, those are just overlapping bear tracks. Right. And really, bear tracks do overlap. They don't look anything like this.
Well, and I've seen lots of bear tracks in the wild over the years, and they're always in lines. And in a line of tracks, the overlap, I mean, when you read about it online or wherever, they say, I think it's every 5, steps that there'll be an overlap, and that's not really true. I looked for a long time to find overlaps because I wanted an example of my own. And I did find one eventually, but it took a while, quite a bit to find those. There's a few places where, up north here, where there's some ponds, up close to the border of Oregon and California, and when the water starts evaporating, usually by July or August, there's a nice wide area around these ponds, these small lakes, and there's always hundreds of bear tracks around them. So I can go up there every year and take my pick of what I want to cast and take pictures of. And out of all of that time, I've only found one overlap. And there's actually, it comes out overall at 17 inches long, which is comparable to some of the Sasquatch tracks, the larger ones. But there's three bear tracks in one impression. And it looks no way like a Bigfoot track, nothing at all.
Well, and don't you also get you get claw marks with the bear?
Well, by the end of summer, a lot of times the claws will wear down, so sometimes you don't see them. But the shape of the foot is completely different than the Sasquatch footprints, and not to mention size and shape and all that. But but you do find claw marks a lot of times.
Well, and also the way the Sasquatch walks and the way the bear walks. Let's face it, a Sasquatch is on 2 legs and the bear's on 4 legs. And even if you did have those overlapping tracks of a bear, you have to say, well, what are these other tracks just right next to it? It looks like a front foot.
Well, yeah, I mean, and look at the spacing between Sasquatch tracks and bear tracks. And I'll send you some pictures also to put on the website showing, how close bear tracks are to each other. You couldn't mistake them with a line of Bigfoot tracks. And it'll provide that too, so people can look at those things and see the differences. So it's not something you would easily mistake. Yeah.
And, I would say, I would even go so far as to say it would be really, really difficult to mistake. You'd have to be absolutely inexperienced or
not too bright.
I wasn't going to say that, but
well, Some of the comments I've heard in the past, way back, I'm thinking, have these people ever seen bear tracks? They make these comments, but have they ever seen anything?
Right.
I've seen bear tracks since I was a small boy, and it's not something you would mistake for one of these things.
No, not at all.
When we first found footprints in the snow in 1972, bear didn't even come to mind.
Right.
We just wondered, what the hell is this? Who in the world's got a foot that big walking around barefoot in the snow?
Barefoot in the snow and next to those torn up coyote guts.
Yeah, not too far from that.
Right. Yeah. And then what was it? About 2 years after that was when you had your encounter, right?
Right.
Okay. And and I got to tell you that one of my favorite stories, and I think it was at the Clark Ranch, where you and your friends ran up the hill. You were chasing these things?
No, that wasn't the Clark Ranch. It was around that time period. Yeah, John reminded me of that trip. My friend John Adams, when we had him on. John, my friends and I, we all went in the military out of high school, and it was years before a lot of us reconnected. And John, everybody kind of moved back to Washington, and of course I went to California. But we recently, because the documentary film was being made about me, we were talking about things that happened way back then. Getting different perspectives. And when John, we were talking, and he brought up that one of those trips, and it was one of the few times that we had a large group. There were about 10 of us in our group of friends that hung around high school. And this is one of the few times that all of us went on one trip together, because usually it was 4 or 5 guys and whoever could go. So we went to this place, and I can't remember why we went there. I think it was just because we wanted to go out and look, because we were supposed to be helping Green and Hinden, see what was going on in the area. So we went out there I didn't have that many expectations. And because of the number of us, there were 10 of us there, we built 2 campfires so all of us could stay warm. And we were just kind of standing around talking after dark that evening. And John's younger brother, Jeff, the one that, for people who know the story, we went to where Green and Hinden's camp had been, and we got scared, ran off, and locked him out of the car, and we're going to take off. But anyway, he got bored, apparently. Nobody knew this. He took a rock and he threw it out in the brush, so that instantly got everybody's attention. And then he quietly whispered to John, he says, "Do you think everybody'd get mad if I told them it was me?" And he says, "Yeah, you better be quiet." And then a branch, it was kind of a long, straight branch, or maybe a small tree, I don't know, come flying from out in that direction toward us, out of the dark, and actually hit one of the guys. And this thing was probably 5-6 feet long. And that really got our attention. So we thought, okay, we're going to go charging up the hill and find out what the hell this is. So we all took off running, and we looked back at the fires, and you could see, silhouetted something going around, apparently looking through our food. So we go charging back down to the fire. And John remembered hearing screams. I don't remember too much about that trip, but he said we heard screams and stuff, and we knew it was one of these things there.
There's a good point there. And
we were stupid.
Well, yeah. Just inexperienced. The 1 point, or 2 points, one of them is, and I've thought about this many times since, is if you go out, if you're with a group of people, and, like you said, you leave the vehicle and you go for a walk, and you encounter one of these things, everybody gets scared, and you run and you get back in the car, truck, or whatever, you should probably do a head count before you leave.
Yeah.
And a head count when you're back in the vehicle.
When we were teenagers, we didn't think about that kind of stuff.
Right?
It was every man for himself.
Every man for himself, including the one who's banging furiously, panicking on the side of the car.
I always laugh. John and I, especially, the two of us always laugh about that, because he was working the weekend or it wasn't a weekend, it was summertime, so I don't know what day of the week it was, but I've actually thought about going back and looking at the weather, because the weather was really crappy for that particular few days that summer. It actually hailed. So anyway, he didn't get to go to meet Green and Hendon, so I called another friend who had a car. I didn't have a car yet then, so he agreed to come over and we'd go spend time at their camp. And when we got back, John had called me when he returned from his job, and I think he was gone someplace for a week or two, and he came back, and we talked about it, and I said, well, I can take you there and show you where the place was, because that's where a lot of the activity had been, the reason Green and Hendon picked that place. And he says, yeah, let's go look. So he borrowed his parents' station wagon, and me and him and his younger brother Jeff went, and it was dark when we got there. So we get out, and we had a couple of flashlights, but we didn't turn them on. I was following the same pattern that DeHenden was doing when we walked that area each night, by having no light, just being quiet and listening, and trying to hear what was going on. So it's a gas pipeline area, access way. So there were trees on both sides, thick forest, and it was sort of like field grass in the middle across for the length of this pipeline access. And we walked maybe couple hundred feet maybe from the car alongside of the tree line. And periodically we would stop and maybe shine a light around to see what was going on. So at one point I shined a light across this gas pipeline to the other side. And I don't remember how far apart that was. Not real far, but, between 50 and 100 feet, I suppose. And a couple times did that, didn't see anything. Then one time I saw eye shine, and it was fairly high up. And I could actually see it blinking. And I thought, oh, crap. I turned the light off, and I told the guys really quietly what I saw. And I said, now, watch. We'll turn the light on over and see if we can see it again. So I shine a light, and then something took off running. And it wasn't four-legged. It was boom, 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 like that on two legs. And we were all like, oh, crap. And then it stopped. It stopped. That's what scared us. And I said, okay, let's go back to the car quietly, calmly, don't run. We took maybe 5 steps and broke into sheer panic and run like hell to the car. So we get there, and if anybody's ever seen the old movie Poltergeist, where they get in the car and I think the wife was trying to put the keys in the car, or he was, I don't remember, whoever was trying to put the keys in the car and get it started. Their hands were shaking, they couldn't get the keys in. That was John. I swear they got that idea from John, because he was trying to get the keys in, and I'm going, hurry, hurry, hurry. And we locked the doors. His brother was outside screaming and crying and pounding on the car. John fires the car up and goes taking off, and I said, wait a minute, Jeff's out there. It doesn't sound very nice, but looking back on it, it's funny as hell.
So, oh man. So there you go. Good idea to do a head count first. Everybody's in the car.
Don't traumatize the younger. Yeah, don't traumatize the younger brother for life.
Right. But the other thing is, and this is so true in my experience, and I've heard other people as well. You had low expectations, not on this one, but when you chase the thing up the hill, that you'd find anything. And I got to say, 99% of the time, when I have an encounter, or heard things or saw, I haven't seen them, but I've seen the footprints and heard them and all that kind of stuff. It's always at a time when I least expected it.
Yeah. It was the same with the Clark Ranch thing. We didn't expect anything out there, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, it's like when I found the footprints, the first set I told you about, my buddy said, hey, don't ask. I'm never coming back here again. Because I don't mean to be hard, but don't ask. So I said, okay, great. A month and a half later, I said, look, we're going to go to this other place. We're going to go to where they're not. Remember that?
And there they were.
And there they were.
Dalton had the same issue.
Right, exactly.
He wanted to avoid him, and he walked right into him.
Right. So,
but
the point.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the point being is that they're hiding in plain sight, and they're actually far more prevalent and probably a lot closer than people may realize.
Yeah, I was going to mention that when I had that second sighting back in '88, we were driving up to a location because we'd been finding footprints at the snow line. And I wanted to go up one last time before the snow was gone for the season to see if there was anything new up there. And was kind of daydreaming as I was driving along and saw the movement, and boom, there was one right there in broad daylight. So wasn't even thinking about that area. We still had, ways to go to get to the snow line, and did not expect it to be there at all.
No, that was the one up in...
That was on the Washougal River in Washington.
Oh, okay, gotcha. But you guys had another encounter also in Mount St. Helens area.
Oh, yeah, we went there in 1976, yeah. That was a group of 6 of us, and, I had been there hunting with my dad and uncle before, but wasn't familiar with that particular area. And, of course, I wasn't driving, so I wasn't paying attention where we were going. So on this trip, a couple of college students had told us where the miner's cabin had been located, from the attack in 1924. So that's where we were going. And we ended up getting there at night at Spirit Lake. So we decided to, spend the night across. Of course, there was nobody up there in November. It was November '76. So there was nobody up there. And there was a big parking lot across the road from where the lake is. And there was some kind of a building there. Anyway, we couldn't build a fire because of the wind. And it was very light that night, with the moonlight. So we decided just to go kind of screwing around and, waste some time until we were exhausted, and we just fall asleep somewhere. But we climbed up this ridge, and we were sliding down, the pumice hills. None of us had ever been in pumice, so we didn't realize it was not only slippery, but very caustic to your clothing. So anyway, during all that, we found a line of 19-inch, what looked like 19-inch prints. They were probably 18-inch with some slippage, but they were going up the ridge, and we could see hundreds of the tracks.
Oh, wow.
We never saw anything other than the footprints, but, my friend Scott took pictures and sent them to John Green. And Green just said, "Oh, did you take that with a flash? Pretty good pictures." That was it.
The question is, were they there all along, or were they there afterwards?
We didn't notice the tracks when we got there. We were out there messing around for probably an hour or so, until we decided to go back to the van, and then we figured out that we'd pooled all of our money and everything with Scott, and he lost his wallet and the car keys, or the van keys. So we had to go back up there and try to locate them, and they were actually where we'd sit down to slide down this slope. But that's when we found the tracks. So I don't know if they were there beforehand and we just didn't notice, or the creature was there watching us and then made the line of tracks before we came back. I don't know.
Well, you'd think you would have noticed them before, because when you go back, it's even darker, I'm assuming, right?
It was about, it was a full moon, and it was really bright up there, and that pumice is light colored anyway, so it wasn't like daylight, obviously, but it was pretty light. We didn't have flashlights or anything. We saw very well.
Okay, yeah.
We did take flashlights back to look for the car keys, so that's how we were able to examine the tracks better. And but in the pumice, you couldn't really tell how old they were.
Yeah. But you obviously found the keys in the wallet.
We did. So we didn't get stranded up there.
Yeah, because that would not be a good place to be stranded, Bigfoot or not.
Oh yeah, and there was some of the crazy stuff. I put it in my book, In Search of the Unknown. It was just because it was funny. There were so many funny things that happened. There were funnier things too that I didn't put in there, but that's not really for public consumption. So just, the kind of crap that teenagers do to each other.
Oh yeah. Right.
Well, Tom, any final thoughts before we wrap this segment up?
No, just I think we had a really good discussion, and I want to thank everybody out there for their questions and their comments. We really appreciate those, and so, yeah, keep them coming. We love them.
Well said. Everyone, stay tuned for the next segment.
Welcome. These 5 stories from Alaska are being brought to you by William Jevning and are being narrated by me, Jim Sower. Story number 1. Alaska pilot watches as Sasquatch carries off his bride. Noted author on bear behavior, Alaskan Larry Kenniott, writes that he heard an interesting story. It's unconfirmed at this time, but allegedly was written up in Alaska Magazine at some point. Kenniott is investigating. In the meantime, he writes, "My friend Jack Gwaltney and I traveled to Wasilla, Alaska to meet with Ken Taylor, Jr., and Jack shared this story. He remembered the story's source when we reached the Best Western where we were to eat lunch. Jack said that he was pretty sure that Alaska Magazine carried the story around 1985. I've made a little effort to confirm the story at Anchorage's Lusac Library, but as of yet have had no success. In the spring of 2002, I stopped to see Andy Hall at Alaska Magazine regarding permission to use the story, if located, and talked with Jill Shepard, who was going to look in 1985 magazines for the story. I'll email Andy to see if he's discovered anything yet. Meantime, the story goes like this. Supposedly, a Nome, Alaska, or Bethel pilot and his newlywed wife were en route to Anchorage, where they would make connections for their honeymoon. The weather turned sour, so he touched down in a Cessna 180 or 185 on floats. He taxied to shore where he and his wife looked for a spot to pitch their tent for the night. Having found one, he turned toward the plane to fetch the tent, with his wife following him. He heard his wife scream and turned to see a hairy biped running from the location toward the woods with his wife under one arm. The pilot chased after the critter before realizing that he could best stop it with a firearm and returned to the plane to fetch his rifle. He followed, seeing them 3 times before he lost sight of them. He found only a particle of cloth from his wife's garment. He either spent the night in his tent and looked the next day, or flew on to Anchorage and reported the event to the Alaska State Troopers, who began a search but were unable to come up with any positive results. The wife was never found, and Jack told me that the pilot was distraught and a basket case for years. That's the end of story number 1. Story number 2. Kodiak Daily Mirror, Alaska story. A really creepy, scary, hairy man story that happened in and around Wrangell, Alaska, as told by a Kodiak man by the name of Dana Jack Allen. Also published in the Tundra Drums, Bethel, Alaska, February 1993. Hairy man tells hunter to leave us alone. Editor's note. When he saw a story in the February 1st Kodiak Daily Mirror about a request for stories of sightings of Alaska's hairy man, Dana Jack Allen decided to write down his own experience with the creature called, in other parts of the world, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or the Abominable Snowman. He subsequently also agreed to an interview. Jack Allen, a 40-year-old refrigeration mechanic, lives in Kodiak. By Nell Waage. Kodiak Daily Mirror. Kodiak. Kodiak resident Dana Jack Allen is sure he's had several encounters with what some Alaskan natives call hairy man, the creature known in the Pacific Northwest as Bigfoot. He's also sure the creatures have given him a distinct message. Leave us alone. Jack Allen's fascination with the creatures goes back to a cold morning in 1979 in the remote Etolin Island area near Wrangell. He and his hunting partner were hoping to harvest some of the deer they knew inhabited an alpine meadow at the head of the fjord. Jack Allen wrote the following about his experience. The deer we were hunting were at an elevation of about 700 feet. We arrived at the inlet just before dark in the late fall. My partner did not trust the anchorage or the weather, so he opted to stay on the boat while I climbed up to where we knew the deer were to be spending the night. I found a bench and folded myself up into a large piece of visqueen in my sleeping bag on a small outcropping about 8 feet above a well-worn trail. My friend was to meet me at this spot before dawn the next morning, and we knew we would bag some deer easily in the nearby meadow just after it got light enough to shoot. We had seen deer here several times, but had never taken advantage of the fact. Just before I went to sleep, I remember seeing the mast light on the boat in the inlet and imagining the boom hung with our limit of deer. I was awakened before dawn. Around 1 o'clock, my sleeping bag was jerked out from underneath me instantly, like the magician does with the tablecloth and the glass. I awoke the moment it happened, curled into a fetal position and freezing my fanny. I laid there for a few seconds trying to figure out what had just happened. I figured something had just happened to the boat, or my pal had somehow spotted a trove of fat deer. I sat up and pulled on my boots, looking for my mate to explain what was going on. I was still not fully awake, but for fear of scaring the deer, I refrained from calling to my friend. It had snowed almost an inch since I went to sleep, and peering over the edge, I could see people tracks in the snow leading up the hill toward the meadow. I grabbed my rifle and slogged down the hill, peering at the ground in the dark and wondering how and why my somewhat elderly companion had chosen that unusual method of rousing me from my sack. I was stepping in the footprints in the snow. They were dark and easy to see, and was starting to think my partner had not been the one to zip my bag out from underneath me. Then realization struck, and I was gripped with fear. The tracks I was so carefully stepping in were not human. They were the imprints of bare feet, but almost twice the size of my own size 10 boots. This is not real, I thought. I could hear nothing except the snowflakes falling gently to the ground. Every hair on my body was erect, sensing the air for the obvious logical solution. I cannot shoot anything, I told myself. This is a very carefully planned prank, and all I need to do is lose my control and end up hurting someone. I double-checked the safety on the rifle and determined that this joke was going to be on them. Cool as a cucumber, I walked another few steps up the hill where I would be able to see the crest of the rise I was on. There was a large hemlock tree here, and I decided to climb it and wait out the pranksters, who were trying to scare me out of my wits. Checking the sky, I noticed that within a few minutes the clouds would reveal the full moon, providing me with enough light to see what was going on. I took a few more steps, marveling at the perfection that these guys had achieved with the footprints. Then I knew it was no joke. I felt an unmistakable sense of warning, as clearly as if someone had spoken. It wasn't logic, it wasn't fear, it was communication. I stopped. I looked up, and 15 feet away, one hand on his hip, the other gripping a branch of the hemlock that was just above my head, was the biggest, hairiest guy on 2 legs I ever want to see. Without thinking, I started to thumb the safety off. He turned his head to stare at me, straight in the eyes. His teeth were showing, but It was not a snarl or a grin. I want to say it was a knowing smile. I knew I could place a killing shot, but I also knew it would be wrong, even criminal. He was saying to me with all the power of the Spirit, "Leave me alone." It was as if more than one voice was speaking to me. It was a collective consciousness whispering with the same longing voice, "Leave me alone." One instant he was there, and the next he turned and fled silently into the woods. At first I thought that it was a dream, but then I could feel that spirit like a mist in the forest, wanting to be left alone. Jack Allen said he recalled little as he ran and tumbled down the hill to the beach, hollering all the way. His partner, who was waiting on the beach, insisted he made the trip down in half the usual time. After daylight, the two retraced Jack Allen's steps up the hillside. The footprints he had followed earlier measured 17 inches long and 5 or 6 inches wide. The impressions left in the mossy ground convinced them the creature had weighed 600 to 800 pounds. When they measured from the ground to the hemlock branch the creature had grasped as he turned, they found the distance was 9.5 feet. "My messenger was 7.5 to 8 feet tall," Jack Allen said. He said the creature looked very much like the one portrayed in the movie, Harry and the Hendersons. This one was actually as large, but more lean. He had long, silky hair. On his arm it was a good 6 inches long. He walked erect and was quiet. He made no sound. He was graceful. His movements were graceful. I couldn't see his face too well, but it seemed like his skin was leathery. His eyes were dark. He had a glint in his eye. He had intelligence. A short time after that encounter, he said, the Wrangell Sentinel carried a photograph taken from the air of the tracks of a two-legged creature in the deep snows of the mountains. Jack Allen, who was 40, was raised on a homestead in the Talkeetna Mountains and has spent his share of time in the Alaska bush. He realizes that telling his story will convince some people he is more in the business of hot air than cold. But, as he says, I've spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between when something is scaring me and I'm scaring myself. There is no question in my mind about what I saw. Twice more during the 5 years he trapped in the area, he became convinced the creatures were nearby and letting him know that he was not welcome. A year and a half after the first incident, he set 40 to 50 traps in a new area, rich with mink sign, only to come back the next day to find the traps had all been sprung. Thinking his adversary was maybe a wolf, he moved some and reset some. When he returned the next day, the traps were again sprung, but there was a stick left in one. Clearly not something one would expect of a wolf. Again, he reset some of his traps and moved others. He returned the third day, again beaching his skiff in the same spot and following the same paths to avoid spreading his scent. All his traps were gone. As he walked along the trail, pondering the mystery, he found himself following in what he thought were his own tracks. Then I realized they were alongside the trail, and that I always stay to the trail, he said. The stride was 1.5 times my usual stride, 5 to 6 feet, and they were left in a deep impression in the moss. I realized it was the Sasquatch, giving me a warning not to be in the area. As I launched the skiff, I heard a rattling down in the water. I looked, and the traps were in a pile by the skiff. Jack Allen said he knew the area well and knew there were no other people in the area. In spite of the signs, the area would provide lucrative furs. He said the old trap sign he found told him it had not been trapped since 1939. I pulled out of the creek. I didn't disturb any other places in that area, he said. Sometime later, in another remote spot in the islands, he was in the process of putting together a cedar shake shed as a place to store his gear. He had felled a hefty cedar and was hand-splitting shakes from it when his dog began acting strangely. Henry wasn't afraid of anything, not even a wolf. Most dogs are terrified of even the smell. This time the usually unruffled dog started to whine and crawled on his belly to the skiff. He climbed into the skiff without permission, something he had been trained never to do, and hunkered down under a seat. Jack Allen at first dragged him out, but the dog continued to act terrified. That made me think, so I took a rifle and walked in a 100-foot circle. Then I stopped. I knew I wasn't alone in the woods, so I got in the skiff and left. Motoring back later, he found the huge cedar that he had been working on had been carried to the bank and dumped into the cove. Without going ashore, he turned the skiff around and left. I didn't want to give any indication that I would go against their will. That's the end of story number 2. Story number 3. Turnagain, Anchorage Borough, Alaska, 1955. Greetings. This is a story my mother told me a few times while I was growing up. I recently asked her to tell me the story again so that I could post it online. I would appreciate any thoughts on what it could have been. My mother was one of 12 children who were turned over to an orphanage in Turnagain, Alaska, about 30 miles outside of Anchorage. There were no other children in this home, and it was apparently run or managed by a priest. We do not know the year the children were surrendered to the orphanage. In or around 1955, my mother would have been around 7 years old. The bedroom assigned to the female children was in the attic, with an attic storage access door leading from either side of this bedroom. There were 4 children in this room, 2 of which slept on a bunk bed and 2 on a full-sized bed. My mother was on the top bunk. The people who ran the orphanage had started saying to the children that if they saw or heard anything upstairs in their room, to wake them immediately and they would kill it. My mother's sisters had told her several times that if she ever saw the creature, not to be afraid, and it would not harm her. She thought they were trying to scare her. One night, my mother was awakened by a noise. As she looked down from her top bunk, she saw a small creature walking upright across the room. She describes it as no more than 2.5 or 3 feet tall, shaped like a human, completely covered in very dark long hair, with limbs not disproportionate with its body. Because it was night and she was only able to make out features as the moonlight through the window allowed, she was not able to clearly see its face, hands, or feet. She watched this creature in terror while it walked about the room. She saw it struggling to reach the covers on the lower beds to apparently cover the children up. When the creature started trying to climb to the top bunk where my mother was, she yelled, "Stay away from me!" When she did this, the creature appeared shocked that she was awake and that she had yelled at it. It abandoned its attempt to climb the bunk and was later seen by my mother trying to take the skeleton key out of the bedroom door. It apparently really wanted that key because it stood there a long time trying to get it out of the door, but never succeeded. She did not see the creature leave the room. However, one of the attic storage doors was out of her line of vision. A few weeks later, the children were told to bring some army rations out of the attic storage space. When they went to retrieve them, they found several ration cans opened and discarded in the far corner, or one of those spaces. She thinks there were more than 12, but less than 20. None of the children had reason to sneak food, so they were not likely suspects for the presence of the empty cans. That was the only encounter my mother had with the creature, much to her relief. My mother isn't one to tell fantastic stories. She is now 62 years old, educated, and a very hard worker. She has no illnesses and takes no medication. She has never told any other wild tales. She has also never tried to seek any attention with this story. In fact, there are only a very few people she has told it to. My mother was adopted when she was 9 and taken from her siblings to Oklahoma. She never again saw or spoke to her siblings until 1997, where she had a purely chance encounter with her older brother at a tribal meeting. When they began talking, they did not know they were siblings until one of them mentioned having grown up in an orphanage in Turnagain, Alaska. It didn't take many more sentences after that for them to learn that he was the child born before her. Within hours of this meeting, while they were still thinking about the orphanage, I asked my uncle if he remembered seeing the creature. His face lit up and he described in detail the same creature my mother had. They had only been talking for a few hours and did not have time to coordinate a fabricated story. I have always wondered what this creature was, and so has my mother. Any ideas? Tina Clark. This is the end of story number 3. Story number 4. The Hairy Man by Lynn Snifka. This is an excerpt from Alaska Magazine article, October 2004, titled Monstrous Mysteries from Lake Beasts to Murderous Mud. Alaska has its share of scary legends, by Lynn Snifka. Snipped portions of Snifka's piece speaks to the issue of the Iliamna Lake Monster, which this website doesn't carry. The Hairy Man. When Donald watches the Discovery Channel, especially programs about the unexplained or mysterious wildlife, he sometimes gets the urge to call his brother-in-law Frank. He and Frank talk, said Donald, who didn't want his last name or the name of his village used. And Frank gets somber and quiet. It's at those times they remember. They remember the night more than 25 years ago, and the creature that stood a good 4 feet above their teenage frames in the early winter moonlight. They remember the long arms, the body covered in thick hair, the face with features that were somehow human, somehow not. They remember its strength. I remember watching when he was running through the alders in the moonlight, Donald recalled. And we have lots of alders there. Athabascans call him Nanit-ina, and warn that he'll steal children and raise them up in the wild. There's the story of a man who shot and injured a hairy man. The creature escaped, but left behind his blood, something akin to transmission fluid. In a 1981 publication from the school in the English Bay, a student wrote of her summer in Port Graham and a mysterious figure in the dark that whistled and scared her and hid behind trees. While some dismiss believers as feeble-minded witnesses, and their supporters speak without doubt, Donald is reserved when he speaks, but certain of what he saw that night. The boys were maybe 16 or 17 years old, Donald said. It was the 1970s, and a typical weekend night in their southwest Alaska village. They stayed up late and played cards at Frank's house. The dog started to go crazy outside, Donald remembered, which usually meant there was a bear around. When the barking didn't subside, the boys decided to investigate. As Frank reached for his rifle, they heard someone, or something, toy with the door latch. A massive figure then moved to a broken window that had been recently patched with scrap glass. The creature tried to reach in, cut itself, and ran. At first, we thought someone was playing around with us, so we decided if it came back, we'd run on outside and chase it, Donald said. We thought it was just some stranger coming up from another village to scare us. Donald and Frank eased back into their evening. Then the creature returned and again fumbled with the door latch. The teens rushed onto the porch, which was built on a foundation nearly 4 feet high, Donald said, and we looked up at him. The creature stood in the snow beyond the house. The teens gave chase toward a series of nearby hills. I remember going up the first hill, and when I got to the top, it was already on the third hill, Donald said. There were a lot of hairy man reports from nearby villages for a while. Donald's grandmother, who lived in a neighboring village, told him a story of when she was younger and caught a hairy man. They trapped him somehow, Donald said, and brought him into the village, and they shaved him and found he was just a runaway from World War II, and the army came and got him. The man gone wild, or outside man, is a common theory in Alaska Native culture, said Phyllis Morrow, professor of cultural anthropology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Morrow studied Yupik culture in western Alaska and found the phenomenon so common that a set of rules exists for encounters with a wild person. You can approach them, Morrow said. You can speak certain things to them in Yupik, and you can draw them back. Again, though, there's the burden of proof. I think it's just myths and stories, said Siebert, the pilot. I've spent over 20 years flying all over, and I look everywhere I fly. I love looking for animals. I've counted for the Fish and Game Department of Alaska just about every kind of animal you can count out there from an airplane, and I've never seen anything I couldn't explain. The outside man, or hairy man, like the Iliamna lake monster, or even the deadly Turnagain mud, may simply be cautionary tales or coping mechanisms, colorful ways to explain the otherwise unexplainable, or tools to ensure respect for one's elders. Reports have certainly become more rare as technology has grown more sophisticated. When village parents can call from house to house to check on their kids, it might be less important to scare them with stories of the hairy man who may get them if they stray too far from home. How better to keep children away from water's edge than to have them imagine being torn apart by a helicopter or struck ill by a sea monster's gaze? The standards of truth in terms of documented evidence, photographs, stuff like that, you're not going to find it, Morrow said. These are cultural understandings of what happens. It's true in people's experience, and it's meaningful to them. So what, then, of the blood on Frank's window, and Donald, who saw tremendous footprints in the autumn snow? Lynn Snifka is a freelance writer based in Anchorage. Copyright Alaska Magazine, October 2004. This ends story number 4. Story number 5, Strangest Story Ever Told. By Harry D. Kolp. 1900, Thomas Bay, Alaska. The writer of this story has been dead for several years now. At one time, back in the early 30s, he had his story written up, ready to send away. Something happened, and the manuscript was put into a box and forgotten. The story should be listed among the classics, for it occurred before anything was known about hirsute homins, before anyone knew about these beings, anyone except for the natives, that is, and they have known all along. But no one listened until the 21st century. Dear readers, during the years the Devil's Country story had been passed along by word of mouth so often that the details had become obscured. It was then a very pleasant surprise when Mother found the manuscript just a short time ago and gave it to me to read I found it fascinating, and I was left with a feeling of curiosity. I wonder if any of you readers will be curious. I wonder. Well, I'll just let you wonder. Sincerely, Virginia Culp, daughter of Harry D. Culp. Chapter 1. The spring of 1900 found 4 men batching together in a shack at Wrangell, Alaska. All 4 were broke, as is usual with prospectors. As luck would have it, I was one of the 4. For reasons which will be quite obvious, I will just call the other 3 John, Charlie, and Fred. Charlie came into the shack one night in April, all excited, and said, "Fellows, I have been on the trail of an old Indian for the last month, trying to get him to tell me where he picked up a piece of free gold quartz that he has at his camp." I never say anything about it before, because I wanted to get the story from him first, and today he spilled the beans. He told me to go up to Thomas Bay and camp on Patterson River on the right side, travel upriver for about 8 miles, and then turn to the high mountains. And after traveling about 1.5 miles, I would find a lake shaped like a half moon. Plenty of stone like I found on the slide there, he said. Thomas Bay is known by the Native Americans in Alaska as the Bay of Death. About 150 years ago, a slide down one of the mountains wiped out a village, killing over 500 of the inhabitants. Well, of course, a prospector is ready to stampede on a whisper of a gold any place, and we were no exceptions to the rule. We all talked the matter over, and finally it was decided that we would run our faces for an outfit and send Charlie to look the prospect over. While he was gone, John, Fred, and myself would hustle work somewhere for another grub stake and to pay the old one off. The forepart of May, Charlie loaded his outfit into a canoe and, having favorable weather, left Wrangell for Thomas Bay, which lies northwesterly about 50 miles. He had 3 months' supplies, but was to come back any time sooner if he found out anything. But if he didn't show up in that time, we were to put out a search for him. John and Fred took a contract to get at wood, and I got a job in the Wrangell sawmill. Things went along until the first part of June, when, on a Sunday in late afternoon, we all being home, and in walks Charlie, without a coat or a hat, and looking as if he had been through hell. He didn't give us any greeting whatsoever, just heaved a piece of quartz over into a corner of the room and said, "Get me something to eat. I'm all in, and I want to rest." The fellow looked it, and after he had eaten, he turned in without telling us a thing about his trip. We picked up the piece of quartz, and say, boy, it was sure a pretty thing to look at for a prospector. Oh, it was shot through with gold specks, just like a badly freckled-faced kid. Were we excited? I'll say we were. Just before dark, we walked down to the beach to bring Charlie's outfit in, and as he had come up to the shack with only that piece of quartz in his hand, but there wasn't a thing in the canoe except the oars. Not much sleep for us that night, but Charlie never stopped sawing wood. We had hard work getting Charlie up for breakfast next morning, but when he did roll out, he just ate, borrowed a coat and hat, and left the house without saying a word or even answering the one question out of the many put to him by us. All of us, being excited and feeling ourselves worth a fortune, did not go to work that day, but sat around the shack and passed that blamed piece of rock back and forth to each other while we talked and waited for Charlie to come back and make his report. Oh, believe me, we were anxious to hear it. Along in the afternoon, he came in and said, "Oh, fellas, the SS Drigo will be in on her way south early tomorrow morning. Can you give me enough money for my ticket to Seattle? I'm through with Alaska and never want to see it again. I'll tell you about my trip to Thomas Bay and where I found that quartz, but my advice to you is to forget about it. It will never do you any good and will only cause you a lot of mental and physical pain. If I were not partners, I would never open my lips about this trip or what I found. But if you promise never to mention my name in connection with that, well, what I tell you, or mention the name of Thomas Bay to me again, well, I'll give you the straight of my experience up there. Well, judge for yourselves as to my saneness, because this is the most astounding thing you ever heard, and as far as I am concerned, is beyond me to reason it out. Don't ask any questions to prolong my story any longer than it takes to tell it, as I want to leave Alaska and forget it if I can. I will try to make one telling plain enough. This is Charlie's story. The first night after leaving Wrangell found me in Ideal Cove. Next night I reached Muddy Bay in time to make camp again. The third night I hit Ruth Island in Thomas Bay. I spent the next day looking up Patterson River for a suitable place for a good camp, which I found a quarter of a mile from Tidewater on the right-hand side, looking up the river. Broke camp on Ruth Island the next day, and moved up to the place that I'd picked out the day before, put up my tent, packed up my outfit, and left the canoe on the riverbank. The next day I spent cooking beans, cutting wood, and making things comfortable for a long stay. As it looked like rain, I wanted to get things fixed up to keep dry. It started to rain that night and just kept it up for days. I lost track of time, as each day was just like the one before. Had nothing to read, was all alone, couldn't do anything without getting soaked, and the roar of the river and the wind through the timber just about drove me bugs, so I put in most of my time sleeping. Finally, the weather broke, and I got out. Spent several days in trying to find the old Indians' Half-Moon Lake, but couldn't get it spotted. I did find, about 2 miles from camp upriver, and about a mile from it, a lake shaped like the letter S. Well, on the creek coming out from the lower end, I panned some pretty good colors, but, as I figured, not enough to get all excited about, yet an indication of gold in the country. Talk about a dead country. Whew, that sure is. There doesn't seem to be any life in there at all. You might spend all day in the timber without even seeing a squirrel. I was getting sort of tired of beans, rice, and bacon, so I made up my mind that I would go over to a ridge about 8 miles east of the S Lake and get a few grouse, as I thought I could hear a few hooters up there when I was at the head of this lake. I left come the next morning, which was a fine sunny day. I took only the rifle with me, and when I came to the ridge, sure enough there were a few grouse hooting. I shot 2 and had gotten them when I bagged another one, which fell down the ridge about 100 yards before it hung up. While on my way back down to pick it up, I found that piece of quartz. Up to that time I had paid very little attention to what the country I was in looked like, as it was so heavily timbered and brushy. The formation didn't show up, and I had no tools with me to uncover it. The top of an old snag had broken off and fallen, scraping the top moss loose and dirt for a space of about 8 feet wide and 18 or 20 feet long, uncovering this quartz ledge, which was where I found this piece. This ledge was worked smooth by a glacier at one time. I couldn't find anything to break a piece off with, so I used the butt of my gun to get that piece. In so doing, I broke the butt of my gun, thus ruining it for further use. This didn't worry me any, as I knew there was not a game in the country larger than a grouse. My first thought was of the richness of the quartz and of you fellows, and getting back to town to round you up so we could get busy on it. After looking over and enjoying the feeling of knowing I had made a rich find, I covered the ledge up again with moss, limbs, and rotten chunk. Finishing that job, I thought I would climb the ridge directly over the ledge and get my landmarks, so I could come back to it again or tell you where it was if anything should happen to me. This I did, climbing straight up over the ledge on the ridge till I reached the top, which was about 600 feet above where I found the ledge. I looked down below me and picked out a big tree with a bushy top. taller than the rest and about 50 feet to the right of the ledge. Looking over the top of this tree from where I stood, I could see out on Frederick Sound, Cape of the Straight Light, the point of Vanderput Spit, Point Vanderput, and turning a little to the left, I could see Sequoia Island, Kodiak, from the mouth of Wrangell Narrows. Satisfied with that, I turned half around to get back a sight on some mountain peaks, and lying below me on the other side of the ridge from the ledge was the half-moon lake the Indian had told me about. Right there, fellows, I got the scare of my life. I hope to God I never see or go through the likes of it again. Swarming up the ridge toward me from the lake were the most hideous creatures. I couldn't call them anything but devils, as they were neither men nor monkeys, yet looked like both. They were entirely sexless, their bodies covered with long, coarse hair, except where the scabs and running sores had replaced it. Each one of them seemed to be reaching out for me and striving to be the first one to get me. The air was full of their cries, and the stench from their sores and the bodies, it made me faint. I forgot my broken gun and tried to use it on the first ones, and then I threw it at them and turned and ran. Oh, God, how I did run! I could feel their hot breath on my neck. Their long, claw-like fingers scraped my back. The smell from their steaming, stinking bodies was making me sick, while the noises they made, yelling, screaming, and breathing drove me mad. Reason left me. How I reached the canoe or how I hung on to that piece of quartz is a mystery to me. When I came to, it was night, and I was lying in the bottom of my canoe, drifting between Thomas Bay and Sequoia Island, cold, hungry, and crazy for a drink of water. But only to satisfy the latter urge, I started for Wrangell, and here I am. You no doubt think I am either crazy or lying. Well, all I can say is, there is the quartz. Never let me hear the name of Thomas Bay again, and for God's sake, help me get away tomorrow on that boat. So passed out Charlie from our lives. We put his story down as a fantasy, caused by loneliness and morbid thought. This ends the 5 stories. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning, @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open out there.